Hello, my name is William Teague, an employee of the Kerr-McGee Corporation. With me is Dr. John Ezell, David Ross Boyd Professor of History and Curator of Western History Collections in the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Ezell has recently authored a book entitled Innovation in Energy, the Story of Kerr-McGee, which is a history of the Kerr-McGee Corporation covering the first 50 years in the life of this natural resource company. Dr. Ezell.
The chairman and chief executive officer of this dynamic corporation, Dean A. McGee, has pioneered the exploration and development of earth minerals and chemicals through 42 years of depression, global conflicts, economic expansion, population explosion, exploration of outer space, and the emergence of the nuclear age. We feel very fortunate that Mr. McGee has agreed to respond to our questions about the past, the present, and even use his crystal ball on the future of Kerr-McGee.
Mr. McGee, the first question, obviously, is where and how did the corporation begin?
Well, the corporation began with, really with Bob Kerr and Jim Anderson in 1929. There was a small two-rig drilling company drilling in Seminole, and at the as the boom phased down in Seminole, they were having a little trouble finding work for their rigs, and they talked to Bob Kerr about helping them find work for the rigs. Jim Anderson, Bob Kerr's brother-in-law, was the superintendent of drilling for this company, and had recommended the senator to the owners of the company. It finally ended up that Jim Anderson and Bob Kerr bought the company for $50,000. I'm not sure, but what they had only $5,000 to put down on the purchase price, and went to bought the rest of it on the cuff.
And that was starting out in the middle of the Depression, too, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Just the Depression came on, of course, at the fall of that same year.
Then, Mr. McGee, a bit later, of course, you're going to join the company. And although you were a very young man at the time, your work in geology in the Oklahoma City field certainly had given you the reason to expect a bright future with Phillips. What was there about Anderson and Kerr Drilling Company in 1937 that induced you to leave Phillips Petroleum Company and join that particular firm?
Well, it really was not the Anderson Kerr Drilling Company. By 1937, I had become chief geologist of Phillips, right, and liked very much my job, and liked the Phillips Petroleum Company and the people I worked with. But when the opportunity to join a small company and share in its growth came along, I looked on it as a challenge, really, and not because I was dissatisfied in any way with either my progress or the people I worked with in Phillips.
At that time, Bob Kerr is going to come into your life because Bob Kerr was very active in opening up the extension of the Oklahoma City field. As an employee of Phillips, were you aware of Kerr's role at that particular time?
Well, I knew of his role, yes, but I didn't know him personally at that time. Mr. Adams and Mr. Lynn were associated with him in that effort.
And I'm sure at that time you had no thoughts that you would probably ever be associated with him in business.
By that time, I was in the Bartlesville office,
right,
when this occurred. Yeah.
That gives rise to thought. The late senator, of course, is remembered in large measure for his public service. How long was he active in the corporation after he became interested in politics?
Oh, I'd say he was active in the company from the standpoint of interest and keeping up with what went on right up to the time of his death. Of course, after he became governor, he had very little time to spend on the actual administration of the company, but he kept up with the projects by telephone.
So he
Not any of the details, but I'd spend hours talking to him on the telephone.
he left most of the details to others.
Yes, that's right.
Well, of course, Kerr-McGee has been a very innovative company throughout the years, and certainly one of the most significant things about the company among these famous innovations, because this one's, as you're well aware, spawned a multi-billion-dollar industry, was the company's decision to gamble in the Gulf of Mexico in 1947. What led Kerr-McGee, and of course by that time essentially it was to a great degree your decision, to decide to explore for oil and gas in the Gulf?
Well, at that time we had an office, a geological office in Wichita, Kansas, one in Shreveport, and one in the Rocky Mountains, as well as Oklahoma City. And we were doing geophysical work and geological work and spending quite a lot of money. And what we were finding were very small reserves of oil and gas. So one day I just sat down and decided that to close all those offices, take the money we had and go to the Gulf of Mexico, where if we were successful, the rewards would be much greater. Instead of finding oil fields with 1 million or 2 million or 3 million barrels of oil, you find them with 25, 50 million barrels of oil.
What were the major problems, what were the major problems connected with offshore oil and gas recovery at that time? It had to be a new technique, new science.
Well, as you probably know, at that time there had been a few wells drilled close to land on causeways built out. One off of High Island, Texas, I remember, and Creole Field in Louisiana, and some in California. But there really wasn't any technology for drilling in the ocean at that time.
Now, of course, since that time, Kerr-McGee has pioneered a number of methods currently employed in offshore drilling. In your opinion, what are some of the technological advances that Kerr-McGee has contributed to the offshore industry?
Well, of course, the first well we drilled, it started the whole thing. We used the small or minimum platform and a floating barge in which we put the mud pits, the mud pumps, the quarters, the storage areas, which permitted us to have a small platform. We pioneered that, and in the beginning, this was the way the early wells were drilled. Then we pioneered the drilling of a well with a submersible barge, one that sat on the bottom. And this is the Rig 40 that you mentioned earlier. Then probably one of our most significant contributions to the technology was the use of the big stabilizing columns. As I said earlier, when we finally realized we never brought these rigs inshore, but then we designed a rig, and Paul Wolf and Cy Yu were the designers, that could use these large outboard stabilizing columns. And this was the forerunner of both the submersible and semi-submersible rigs in the world. They all have them now. We made the mistake, we patented the stabilized column, but we only registered in the United States. And we've only collected one royalty because most of the rigs have been built outside the country.
Now, you've been building some rigs for use in the North Sea, modern rigs. Any innovations that the company can claim?
Yes, I think, and again, Paul Wolf and Cy Yu are the designers of this rig. They designed a rig in about 1963 or 64 specifically for the North Sea work. It is a very rugged piece of equipment with 6 legs. It was a jack-up type rig. And you might be interested that first rig has never missed a day of work in the North Sea since 1964, which attests, I think, to the design of it and the fact that the people like to use the rigs. Sure. And we subsequently built 2 more on the same design. Well, we had 4 German partners in a company called Transocean Company. We owned 51%, they owned 49% of it.
Earlier we talked about how in the evolution of the corporation you'd gone from a drilling company and added production, refining, and this sort of thing. How did Kerr-McGee evolve from an oil and gas company basically to a natural resource corporation?
Well, this was by design also to a great extent. In the early 50s, we made the conscious decision to get out of the land drilling business and to diversify into other energy materials. And we began to sell off our drilling rigs. And over a period of several years, we got completely out of the land drilling business, stayed in the offshore business, and began to look at such things as potash and phosphate, which are plant foods that you have to find and which are intimately involved in the energy business, the growth of food. And also in the early 50s, when the government set up its military procurement program to find and produce uranium in this country, we began to participate in 1952 in that. 1948, when they started that program, I think there were only 2,000 tons of known uranium in the United States. And they did a very wise thing, and if they'd approached the oil shale, for instance, the same way as they approached the matter of securing uranium, they'd be surprised at what would happen. The government simply said that if they published a circular, it said if you find uranium, we'll buy it at this price, depending on the grade. They set up buying stations all through the West. And then they said if you build a mill, we'll negotiate a contract that will let you recover your cost plus a profit. And in 10 years, by 1958, they had to withdraw from the program because they had more uranium than they could use.
Actually, how different is finding, say, potash or uranium from finding oil from a technician's point of view?
Not a whole lot.
So you felt you already knew a technique that could be used for this?
Yeah, we had the tools, and I think some of the knowledge, yeah.
Well, since Kerr-McGee has become one of the largest producers of uranium in the United States, how do you view nuclear power in the light of the adverse publicity that it's getting, say, within the last 6 months?
Well, I think that nuclear power remains our only relatively short-term and viable answer to generating power. Coal, of course, will be used, but actually coal is a dirtier and more polluting source of generating power than uranium is. When you boil it right down, the nuclear plants are clean. So far, they've been, in spite of the 3 Mile Island accident, they've been absolutely safe. There hasn't been a single fatality in the nuclear generating industry to date. 22 years now since Shippingport reactor went critical, and in 22 years there hasn't been a fatality in the business. It's, in spite of all the counterculture protestations and allegations, it still is, I think, the most environmentally acceptable source for power generation.
If we may, let's turn to thinking a little bit more about coal. It's enjoying a kind of rebirth in the interest of people in the United States, and Kerr-McGee Corporation is involved in it. How do you see coal as a solution? Is it interim only, or is it a long-range solution to energy problems?
Well, I think the burning of coal to produce power is an interim usage, but presently environmental standards hamper both the mining and the burning of coal. It's hampered at both ends, and something has to give somewhere if the coal production is to increase very much. The president, as you recall, talked about 1977, he talked about 1,200,000,000 tons of coal by 1985. Last year, I think the production was slightly over 600 million tons. And 5 years ago, it was about 550 million. It's gone up very, very little. And there are a number of things about the mining of coal, not only the environmental problems connected with mining, but also the MSHA, the new safety regulations in mines have just lowered the productivity until coal was getting very expensive. And then, of course, when you try to burn coal, you have fly ash, you have some coals are high in sulfur, which means you have to have scrubbers, which add large capital requirements to a plant. The coal business is beset with all kinds of problems, but I think on an interim basis, you'll see an increase in the use of coal. I think the government will eventually mandate that the plants burning oil go to coal, and which will require more coal. But the long-range use of coal, I think, is bright. I think the technology will be developed to turn coal into both other fuels and even into hydrocarbons for use.
Historically in this country, coal mining has been identified as an eastern part of the United States operation. Where are the Kerr-McGee operations?
They're in the eastern part of Wyoming, in the eastern part of the Powder River Basin of Wyoming, where there are very large seams of coal. I think in the northeastern part of Wyoming and the southern part of Montana, there's some 20 or 30 billion tons of coal that can be mined by open pit methods, surface mining methods. The coal has a lower BTU content than most of the eastern coal. It's about 8,000, 8,500 BTUs, which makes the coal a subbituminous coal. And of course, it's quite a long ways from the major markets.
If I recall Dr. Ezell's manuscript, as a young geologist, you surveyed some of that Wyoming area.
Well, I walked over quite a lot of the country back in the early years, yes.
Were you looking for coal? Or?
No, I was trying to find a place to drill for oil.
Probably another one of these quotes that didn't get said, but the senator before his death was quoted one time as saying that he expected to fly to the moon sometime in a rocket that was propelled by one of Kerr-McGee's non-petroleum products. And I suspect that he was probably talking about maybe one of the byproducts of Seals Valley, California, where, as you're well aware, the dry lakes there, one of the richest deposits of minerals in the nation. What are Kerr-McGee's mineral extraction operations in California, and what about some of the end products that is being produced there?
I think on the first on the senator's quote, I think what he said was that if man ever goes to the moon, that Kerr-McGee will have a part of it now. The senator, of course, was gone by the time we acquired Searles Lake. But Searles Lake is a very unique accumulation of minerals. It's an old glacial lake that has dried up and has a number of salt beds in it that are saturated with brine. The salt beds extend down to about 700 or 800 feet in depth in the lake. And there's an assemblage of minerals that's unusual. The principal mineral is sodium carbonate, soda ash. There's sodium sulfate. There's boron products. As a matter of fact, the company is the second largest producer of boron products in the world, actually. And there's potash, there's tungsten, there's bromine, there's some lithium. It goes on and on, just to...
Sounds like a jackpot.
Yes. Yes, and we've been trying to exploit that jackpot, too.
You mentioned that these minerals are extracted from the brine. I assume then the water is put back into the subsurface area. Is this regenerative, or is there some kind of life expectancy for this species?
No, it's regenerative to an extent. The effluent from the plants is returned to the lake, and they do pick up additional minerals. As a matter of fact, the lake, Searles Lake, is the textbook example of what's known as phase rule chemistry, and it's in most of the textbooks as the prime example. And the reason for this is that when you change anything in the brines, if you change the temperature or the concentration of even one constituent, then the whole thing changes. So things drop out and other things go in solution. It's known as phase rule chemistry.
Now, these operations are carried on by the Kerr-McGee Chemical Corporation. Are there any other types of operations by this corporation that we haven't touched on?
The chemical company?
Yes.
Yes, they produce phosphate in Florida as a partner of American Cyanamid, and also the chemical company owns large undeveloped deposits of phosphate. Did I say potash there a minute ago? I should have said phosphate.
Right.
Phosphate in Florida, and they produce potash in Carlsbad Basin in southeast New Mexico. They operate two plants at Columbus, Mississippi, produce titanium paint pigment and electrochemical metals, manganese metals, and we're a large producer of sodium chlorate, which is an oxidizing agent. At Henderson, Nevada, the company produces there also some electro chemicals, and it is at Henderson that the company produces the ammonium perchlorate, which is the oxidizing agent for the space shuttle, the thing you asked about earlier. So the senator's prediction may turn out to be true after all.
What are your future plans as far as chemical operations are concerned?
Well, we intend the chemical company's operations are based on natural resources. And what we intend to do is to continue to explore and try to discover those resources. When we find a competitive deposit, we'll put it in production.
You're also in the wood business.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we're sort of in the wood business by accident. We were exploring in southeast Missouri around the St. Francis Mountains for lead and zinc, and there was a large acreage there that was unleased, and the company would not permit anybody to explore it. We couldn't get permits to explore it, nor could anyone else. And while we were there, our bank in Chicago called us and told us this company was for sale. So we bought the Moss Tie Company. We bought the Moss Tie Company in the middle 60s, or 1963 or 4, along in there, really to get the minerals. They had about 230,000 acres of minerals and about 260,000 acres of timberland. And what we paid for the company really was probably less than the value of the minerals. The other things came to us as a part of the deal. They had about 10, they were a large producer of treated ties and utility poles. We had thought when we bought the company that we would divest the plants, the wood treating business, but just shortly after we acquired the company, that business got good and has continued to be a very good contributor to our earnings.
Kerr-McGee has justifiably in recent years received an accolade as being one of the 5 best managed corporations in the nation. It's widely diversified, many subsidiary units. What management philosophy do you utilize to bring together this force of people and merit that recognition?
Well, I think, first of all, you start with good people. If you have able, talented, skilled people, you're 3/4 of the way home. And then I think with our people, the fact that they're willing to work. I believe the employees of Kerr-McGee work harder than the employees of most companies. And I think the combination of knowing what they're doing and working harder at it is what pays off.